What was Sauron's master plan? How did he intend to win the War of the Ring? And what were his initial steps? Let's take a look. This is a series of videos exploring the story behind the story of the Lord of the Rings, the tale of the War of the Ring, where armies of orcs, men, elves, dwarves, Nazgul, and Oloponts clashed over Middle-earth with all the tragedy, horror, and bravery that it brought. This time we'll focus on what Sauron's plan for the war really was, starting with the simple truth that this is a war that Sauron wants. In every war, there's an aggressor, the side that first attacks the other or fires the first shot. And in this case, it is Sauron. Of course, it is. He wants to control all of Middle-earth over the years and centuries. Sauron had tried to dominate Middle-earth several times, most recently with the War of the Last Alliance of Elves and Men at the end of the Second Age, when the One Ring was cut from Sauron's finger and thus lost, and Sauron himself was defeated but not gone for good. The Elves and Men kept a long watch for his return. Gondor built a series of guards and watchtowers around Mordor just in case. 1,000 years into the age, Gandalf was sent by the Valar, along with the other Istari, to assist, empower, and direct this effort. Eventually, Gandalf did manage to track down Sauron. He had been hiding in southern Mirkwood within the fortress of Dol Guldur, under the guise of the Necromancer, gathering his strength there for centuries. There's a bit of history here about Gandalf's growing suspicions and past attempts to reach Dol Guldur, but the definitive moment was in the year 2941 of the Third Age, when Gandalf finally convinced the White Council to join him in attacking Dol Guldur. That's what Gandalf was doing when he went missing in The Hobbit. Sauron was forced to flee to Mordor and officially re-announced himself to the world many years later. Gandalf had long suspected war was coming, but this was what finally drew Sauron into the open. Gandalf had been concerned that whenever the war came, he knew it was inevitable with Sauron around. Sauron would attempt to use Smaug's presence within the Lonely Mountain. He thought rightly that the elves of northern Mirkwood, Lothlorien, and possibly even Rivendell would be exposed to possible dragonfire attack if Smaug wasn't dealt with, hence Gandalf's support for the quest for Erebor. Although the events that unfolded in that story are too far removed from the War of the Ring to be counted as part of that war, they did indeed heavily influence the geopolitical situation in northwest Middle-earth. The elves were freed from the threat of Smaug, the troll and orc kingdoms around the Misty Mountains were weakened, Erebor became a predominant stronghold once again, and Dale was repopulated as well, leading to a strong alliance between dwarves and men, all of which proved vital in that later war. Of course, the most important thing that happened in 2941 during the quest for Erebor was the One Ring passing into the hands of Bilbo Baggins. Gandalf had his doubts about it at the time, but no one really grasped the significance of what had happened and were focused on other things. We'll come back to the ring in a moment since it's clearly important, but let's focus now on the more conventional war preparations. Both sides spent the following few decades gradually planning for war. This was always going to be another war of two massive forces facing each other. Saruman's forces were a bit of a wild card later on, but in general, we are looking at the nations of the east and south of Middle-earth, Mordor, Run, Herad, and so on, against Gondor and their allies, Rohan, the last remnants of the once powerful elven kingdoms, and the dwarves with their human partners. It is 77 years from Bilbo's adventures in The Hobbit to the official start of The Lord of the Rings, when Gandalf tells Frodo what his ring actually is. Sauron uses that time to amass his forces and defenses, starting with calling the 9 rings back to him in Mordor. They hadn't been quiet all the time before then. By chance, the Witch King in particular had spent many years crushing and undermining Arnor and Gondor, the kingdoms descended from the Númenóreans, Sauron's ancient foes. The world would have looked very different but for that. Sauron taking this time to build his army means that it was immense by the start of the war, as well as his own orcs. There were trolls, half-trolls from Herad, Wain Riders, men from Herad, Easterlings from Run, and naval support from the Corsairs of Umbar. Essentially most of the east and south of the map of Middle-earth that we know swore fealty to Sauron. He also developed his infrastructure for the war. We get a brief glimpse of this when Sam and Frodo make it into Mordor in the book. The camera sort of zooms out, and Tolkien tells us a bit of what is there. Neither he, Sam, nor Frodo knew anything of the great slave work camps far south in this vast domain beyond the shadows of the mountain by the dark, sad waters of Lake Nirnan, nor of the great roads that ran east and south to tributary lands, from which the soldiers of the Tower brought long wagon trains of goods and booty and fresh slaves. Here in the northward regions were the mines and forges, and the musterings of long-planned war. Basically Sauron had his support infrastructure and logistics sorted out, his army was kitted out with weapons and armor, food grown to feed them, and it all paid for by funds extracted from tributary nations, and the army was massive and growing all the time. Frodo and Sam spy what is effectively an ad hoc city built on the plain of Gorgoth inside Mordor, where his soldiers gathered and waited for the order to advance, and that Oliphant that Sam saw outside Mordor that was part of even more forces rallying to Sauron's call. Tolkien doesn't give us many precise numbers, but at the final battle of the Moran, the battle that took place just outside Mordor while Frodo and Sam were actually at Mount Doom, there seemed to have been in excess of 60,000 in the Dark Lord's army. You can add to that the numbers he had committed and lost in the attacks on Ossel and Minster, the force that crossed the Anduin at Carandros, his allies the Corsair of Umber, and the significant forces that attacked various northern targets at the same time. We'll cover all of those things later in the series, but overall it's fair to say that at the start of the War of the Ring Sauron had well in excess of 100,000 troops at his disposal plus elite servants, like the Nazgul. Then there were Sauron's alliances, primary among these of course was Saruman, who was amassing his own army of orcs and Dunlendings. It's unlikely that Sauron ever 100% trusted Saruman, but he certainly put in the time to get him on side. The strategy here is pretty straightforward. Saruman was based at Isnard, which guarded the only real way through the massive mountain ranges that split Middle-earth into western and eastern halves. Yes, there are passes through the Misty Mountains, but if you want to march an army through the Gap of Rohan, really is the only overland route for hundreds of miles. Even if Saruman betrayed Sauron, he could still be counted on to keep Rohan occupied, preventing them from supporting Gondor when Sauron attacked them. At least that was the plan, and Sauron was also trying to undermine Gondor via the Palantiri. He found that he couldn't dominate Denethor's mind as he had wanted to. Denethor really had an astonishingly powerful mind for a human, living up to his Numbermanorian heritage, but he did manage to repeatedly show Denethor the might of Mordor growing, and make him fearful, defeated, and on the defensive, and we know how that ended in the short term, though it meant that whereas Denethor supported limited guerrilla warfare against Sauron's forces led by Famar's rangers, he never really contemplated anything more offensive, leaving Sauron the space to build his forces in peace. Facing Sauron were the elves, who were severely depleted in numbers, dwarves, who had also fallen from the height of their powers, and humans of the two great successor powers to Númenor. Gondor and Arnor had been destroyed in a long campaign by the Witch King of Ongmar centuries earlier, and Gondor, well, we've just talked about Gondor. They would be formidable opponents still, but if they could be isolated, there was no reason to think that Minster wouldn't eventually fall. All told, Sauron's army was better prepared, more united, and several times the size of their opponents. We can say with quite a lot of certainty that had this come down to just one army against another, then Sauron would have won. This clear disparity in army sizes played into both sides' strategies for the war. Gandalf, Elend, Galadriel, and co. clearly decided that they couldn't just march on Mordor and expect to win, hence the stealth mission to destroy the ring. A reliance on surprise attacks and pinch points at places like the Hornburg and the Pelennor fields, and high-risk gambles like Aragorn's rallying of the army of the dead. Sauron, on the other hand, seems mostly to have relied on brute force combined with dividing and conquering his enemies. Breaking that down a little bit more, his plan was to focus first with the bulk of his forces on eliminating Gondor as a threat. They were the largest single force opposing him. He would do that with a full frontal assault while preventing their allies from coming to their aid. This latter part of the plan meant simultaneously launching a wide series of smaller attacks along the Gondorian coast against Lothlorien, northern Mirkwood Dale, and so on, and trying to prevent the famed riders of Rohan from aiding their Gondorian allies. Sauron didn't mind losing troops in this. He had plenty to spare, and he even kept most of his forces back in reserve right until the very end. Given his overwhelming dominance in conventional forces, it actually seems like a pretty solid plan. As a magical world, we have to acknowledge that there remained the possibility of either side doing things outside of conventional tactics on the free people's side. This obviously included Aragorn calling on the dead Men of Dunharrow, the ants marching on Isnard, and so on, but Sauron wasn't without his own bits of magic to fortify his army. We're told that he gave the Witch King added demonic force before the final battles, gave all of the Nazgul beasts to ride, and had his forgers create magical weapons to aid their fight. We saw one in Gron the battering ram, which breached Minister's famed gates with ease, and I have speculated elsewhere that Sauron had been stockpiling mithril to make more of such magical weapons to target other enemy strongholds, at which point we should return to the subject of the One Ring. All this talk of amassing armies and planning for a ground invasion of Middle-earth might give the impression that Sauron had overlooked the One Ring or decided that he didn't need it. Nothing could be further from the truth. He was obsessed with it. He knew that with it, he would be whole again, and immensely more powerful. I'm sure in his own mind he would have been unstoppable. The power of the 3 elven rings would have been broken. Elend, Galadriel and Gandalf would have had to take them off, and his darkness would have soon dominated the continent. At least, that's how Elend seems to have understood the situation at the Council of Elend. Of course, if someone else got a hold of the ring and used it to launch their own plans to dominate the world, things would be a whole lot harder for Sauron, and that's what Sauron was convinced anyone would try to do if they got the ring. And now he had reason to believe that the ring had been found when he called evil things to him in Mordor, rallying his troops. Gollum had been drawn there. He was captured, interrogated, and Sauron discovered about Baggins and Shire. He sent an emissary to the dwarves of Erebor in case they knew what and where that was, sent out orc hunting parties, and released Gollum back into the wild, hoping that he would be drawn to it and Sauron could take it from him eventually. He even sent out the Nazgul, his most powerful and loyal servants, uncloaked and invisible, to hunt it down. In short, it was obviously in Sauron's best interests to hunt for the ring, but to do so in as low-key a way as possible. He didn't really want the opposition knowing what he knew or what he was up to. How this tied into his war plans was that he knew that he now had to go on the offensive. After all that time amassing his armies, he couldn't run the risk that someone else might use the power of the ring to rally their forces against him. Much better to attack now and seize the advantage, added to which it would be easier to find the ring in territory he occupied with an enemy defeated. As we noted at the start of this video, he was the aggressor here. His closest and strongest enemy was Gondor, so he'd start there. The rest could wait anyway. All of this brings us to the acknowledged first real battle of the War of the Ring, Sauron's attack on Osgiliath on June the 20th, 318 of the Third Age. To put this into the context of the main story, at this point Gandalf had just told Frodo about the One Ring, but Frodo had yet to leave Bag End. Things were still very calm in the Shire. Anyway, Osgiliath was a strategically important city, and a symbolically important one too. For a long time, it was the capital of Gondor before Minister. However, at the time of the War of the Ring, it was largely abandoned, although a Gondorian garrison was often placed there to protect the main bridge that crossed the wide Anduin River. Osel was attacked by a small army from Mordor led by the Nazgul. Boromir and Famir led the resistance for Gondor and ended up pushing the enemy back and destroying the bridge over the Anduin. So a bit of a draw. All in all, that initial battle over, Sauron went back to gathering his forces for a while and sent the Nazgul out on the quiet to try to find the ring. Boromir meanwhile headed off in search of Rivendell, and Famir stayed in the area of Ithilien to the east of the Anduin River, with some rangers doing some guerrilla warfare against any of Sauron's forces who ventured that far out. Frodo and Sam find him there doing just that. Much later in the story, when they passed by that way, although it might seem like a bit of a damp squib of a start to a war, Sauron's intention at this point seems not so much to kickstart his invasion as just test out Gondor's defenses and misdirect his opponents by attacking with just a fraction of his forces and committing the Nazgul there. He probably bought them a bit of time when he immediately sent them out incognito, or as incognito as they ever could be, to hunt for the ring. Sauron also seems to have concurrently launched a small raid against the elves of northern Mirkwood, freeing Gollum, so this first phase of the war was actually relatively low-key, just one notable battle and a few skirmishes, and then everyone settled down to a sort of phony war that lasted a few months. Frodo and then the Fellowship made their way eastwards. The ring wraiths were out searching for the ring until they got washed away outside Rivendell, and everyone was marshalling their forces and defenses. But Sauron's plan was in place. He had tested Gondor's defenses, sent his top team out to hunt for the ring, put in place plans to keep the elves, dwarves and Rohan out of the war for a time, and would now gather his own forces for a spring offensive against Minister. The stage was set for the War of the Ring. Next time we'll look at Saruman's master plan. How had he expected to win the War of the Ring? Because he did have a master plan, albeit short-lived.